Okay, I think we're ready to begin. Welcome, everyone, to our talk today, which we've entitled Together Against Anti-Semitism, Together Against Israeli Apartheid. My name is Jillian Rogin, and I'm really so honored to be speaking with all of you today, and I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to begin by acknowledging that Hamilton is situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga people. The land that I'm on in Hamilton, is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. When we say the words of land acknowledgements, we're not merely uttering words, we're proclaiming our responsibility. We're acknowledging and we acknowledge and commit to decolonizing our hearts and our minds, and we commit to action. We commit to dismantling settler colonization in all of its manifestations. We commit to understanding that slavery in Canada was intertwined with settler colonization, leaving behind a legacy of anti-Black racism. We commit to understanding all forms of racism and all forms of discrimination, including but not limited to sexism, trans and homophobia, xenophobia, ableism, and classism. And all of these things are connected to dismantling settler colonization, and not just in Canada. We recognize that settler colonial projects occur on a global scale, including in Palestine, and all need to be dismantled. Free Palestine. This phrase means that we believe in and we work towards a future for Palestine and Palestinian people that includes dismantling Israeli apartheid. Earlier this week, the London Ontario School Board issued new guidelines for student dress. And in the frequently asked questions section of those guidelines, a Free Palestine t-shirt was used as an example of school dress that would, quote, promote or incite violence. This is a blatant example of anti-Palestinian racism. The term Free Palestine being cast as inciting hatred and violence towards Jewish people. This understanding of anti-Semitism is what we're going to be talking about today, namely the ways in which the accusation of anti-Semitism has been weaponized to label those who believe in a free Palestine as anti-Semitic. We believe that the No More Anti-Semitism conference taking place next weekend will be focused on silencing speech about Palestine, meaning it will be focused on silencing Palestinian people and those who loudly proclaim that Palestine must be free, and that includes all of us here today. The conference on anti-Semitism to be held next weekend by several Jewish institutional organizations is the reason we're speaking out today. We believe that it is going to focus on and privilege anti-Semitism to the exclusion of all forms of racism, and we say no. We say that Canadians of all races, ethnicities, and religions who are targeted by hatred need to get together to explore how we can fight racism and bigotry together, not apart. Anti-Semitism and all forms of Jewish racism are part of a growing movement of white nationalism in Canada and on a global scale. We need to work together to address this. And to do this, we need to differentiate anti-Jewish hatred from otherwise legitimate critiques of Israel. So to help us with this discussion today, I'm really, really honored to share this space with Sheryl Nestel and David Mivasair. Unfortunately, Erika Campbell isn't feeling well, so sadly she's unable to be here today, but I'll be adding some comments in place of hers. We're going to start with Sheryl and move on to David, and then I'll be making some comments. And throughout the webinar, I invite all the participants to put any questions they have in the Q&A box. We have disabled the chat, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So I'm going to start with Sheryl. Sheryl is a retired sociologist whose teaching and research has been in the area of race and racism. She's been active in Palestine solidarity work for several decades. She served on the steering committee of Independent Jewish Voices from 2012 to 2021, and she's currently the co-chair of the IJV, Independent Jewish Voices, No IHRA committee, and she'll talk a little bit more about what that is. Sheryl lived in Israel-Palestine from 1973 to 1988, and she is a founding member of the International Jewish Collective for Justice in Palestine, a group of 17 Jewish organizations from 14 countries, which was founded in 2020. Today, Sheryl will be talking about her co-authored report. She co-authored with Rowan Gaudet, another member of IJV, and the report is called Unveiling the Chilly Climate. This is Suppression of Speech on Palestine in Canada. The report was released on October 12th, 2022 by IJV. And IJV, I should say, is a grassroots organization grounded in Jewish tradition that opposes all forms of racism and advocates for justice and peace for everyone, Palestinians, Israelis, everyone who currently resides in Israel-Palestine. We have active chapters in cities and on university campuses across Canada. So welcome, Sheryl. Oh, and you're muted.
Thank you, Jillian, so much for the introduction and for convening this. And thanks to all the people at IJV Hamilton as well for the work, and others in IJV who have done so much to get this webinar off the ground. And thank to all of you. I really think it's a great attendance that we have here today. So I'm going to start. I don't have a lot of time. So what I'm going to be talking about is how and why the charges of anti-Semitism have become the weapon of choice for pro-Zionists seeking to delegitimize the struggle for justice in Palestine. The recent upsurge in efforts to get governments and civil institutions to pass the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which I want to talk about briefly in a minute, which portrays strong criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism, reflects, I believe, a desperate attempt to use allegations of anti-Semitism to deflect attention from the upsurge in state and settler violence in Israel-Palestine, from solid evidence documented by human rights organizations that Israel is an apartheid state, and from the ideological dominance of the extreme right made clear in Israel's recent elections. These organizations continue to foreground Palestine solidarity efforts as inherently anti-Semitic, despite definitive scholarly evidence that white supremacist anti-Semitism is a much greater threat to diaspora Jews worldwide than pro-Palestine sentiment and activism. So despite claims to the contrary, the reason I want to focus a bit on the IHRA definition is that it's inevitably going to be heard, a call for its passage will be inevitably heard next weekend at the Conference on Anti-Semitism. And despite claims to the contrary, it is not a universally accepted definition of anti-Semitism. And the debate within the Jewish community about this has been quite intense, and one which calls into question, I think this is a question that we need to be asking ourselves in light of this upcoming conference, it is, you know, they claim that Jews have the right to define their oppression. This is something you will hear from the institutional Jewish community. But the question remains, who legitimately speaks for Jews? That is definitely up for debate, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So a few of the points I want to make about the IHRA. The origins of this definition, and I don't have time to get into them, I suggest that if you're really interested in learning more, you go to www.noihra.ca, which is a very extensive repository of resources on the IHRA that Independent Jewish Voices has put together. So the origins of the definition are murky and not very well understood. The criticisms of the definition as highly flawed and dangerous to academic freedom and freedom of speech have been voiced by the world's most respected Jewish academics. And the IHRA has been roundly rejected by university, by academics here in Canada. The Canadian Association of University Teachers passed a unanimous resolution rejecting the adoption of the IHRA on university campuses in Canada. And despite claims by its supporters that it is not an impediment to free speech, it has indeed been used to censor speech both here in Canada and around the world. And in short, the document, I'll tell you in a second about it a bit, is not a document that respects universal principles of human rights. It's a very short definition, which is very clunky and doesn't really make sense to a lot of people. But the problematic part is that it is accompanied by 11 examples of anti-Semitism, 7 of which have to do with criticism of Israel. So you have to begin to wonder really what the intention of this document is. And again, I don't have a whole lot of time to get into it. I'm certainly willing to answer any questions people may have about it. But I'll say more about it also in a second. So many of the most powerful institutions in the Jewish community defend Israel in an unqualified way, despite a well-documented history of brutal Palestinian dispossession dating back more than a century, and the recent escalation of violence and injustice. So this defense extends well beyond intercommunal rhetoric, and it seems to inform the rationale behind the intimate partnership between the various levels of the Canadian government and the institutional Jewish community, with significant benefits, I might add, for both partners. So what we're seeing here in Canada is our government working hand in hand with influential Jewish pro-Israel organizations to protect the Jewish state from criticism and sanctions. And we saw that Canada just voted in the United Nations against a resolution to investigate Israel's involvement in apartheid. So, you know, so that's one example, but the organizations, there are, you know, the Canadian government and Jewish institutions work together to expand trade and diplomatic ties between Israel and Canada, and to enshrine policies that encourage the weaponization of anti-Semitism, including the adoption by the federal government of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. So pro-Zionist groups' Israel right or wrong stance is not shared by at least a third of Canadian Jews, if not more, according to evidence from the 2017 IJV survey and a 2018 Environics poll of the Jewish community in Canada. It was an official poll of the Jewish community. Apparently the Canadian government, we know this for a variety of reasons, is uninterested in the growing lack of consensus about Israel in the world Jewish community, despite the fact that polls show that approximately 60% of Canadian Jews themselves do not see criticism of Israel as in and of itself anti-Semitic. And about half of Canadian Jews believe that accusations of anti-Semitism are quote unquote, often used to silence legitimate criticism of Israeli policies. The reason that we're conducting this webinar is that as Jews, we wish to dissent from those who dominate Jewish communal life and claim to speak for all Jews, despite any semblance of a communal democratic process in determining their policies or actions. I think it's really important to recognize that in contrast to decades past, the donor class now dominates Jewish institutional politics, and anti-intellectualism is the order of the day. Once upon a time, you had learned voices speaking out within the Jewish community. They were heeded. We don't have that anymore. We have the donor class that is communicating with the federal government and the rest of the Jewish community. So these groups that claim to speak for Canadian Jews have extensive connections to Israeli institutions, and their campaigns are deeply influenced by Israeli government strategies of countering pro-Palestine discourse and activism. Their defense of Israel's policies is usually unconditional, and several Canadian advocacy groups have been active in targeting, defaming, and even seeking litigation against those who advocate for Palestinian human rights. And I'll say more about our study and what that showed in a second. So needless to say, allegations of anti-Semitism are almost always employed in these silencing campaigns. And if you are interested in learning the very long history of the development of this stance, I highly suggest that you read a book called Whatever Happened to Anti-Semitism by Anthony Lerman. It came out quite recently, and it's a very deep dive into how we got to the point where anti-Semitism is being weaponized as a tool for supporting Israeli apartheid. So in early 2021, as the intensification of harassment, intimidation, and even litigation against Palestine solidarity activists became more apparent, Independent Jewish Voices Canada decided to undertake a major research project probing the emergence of a chilling effect on advocacy for Palestine, fostered to a large extent by pro-Israel advocacy groups. What we found in our research, most of it took place in academia, was evidence of a vastly consequential and largely undocumented overt and covert suppression of teaching, knowledge production, and activism related to the struggle for justice for Palestine. So in our research, as Jillian mentioned, that we conducted, and Rowan Godet and I together, we collected 77 testimonies from 40 faculty members, 23 students, 7 activists, and 7 representatives of organizations. Testimonies came from participants working at 21 universities in 7 provinces. They represented 11 disciplines, and 82% of those we interviewed occupied tenured or tenure track academic positions. So this was a long project, took us well over a year. It is well over 100 pages long. And those who endorsed the report include Professor Jim Turk, who's the former director of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, Professor Shireen Sakali, co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies, Professor Amos Goldberg, the Jonah M. Mackover Chair in Holocaust Studies in the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and Alex Neve, former director of Amnesty International Canada. And again, you can find the report at www.ijvcanada.org. So in analyzing this massive amount of data, we identified the following categories, which reflected respondents' experiences: political intervention into hiring in universities, restrictions on academic freedom of various sorts, excuse me, self-censorship in relation to Palestine, fear about the potential impact of the IHRA were it to be adopted on campuses, harassment by pro-Israel advocacy groups and media outlets, attacks from academic colleagues, the role of ethnic/racial and religious identity and the experience of harassment, the detrimental emotional impact of self-censorship, harassment, and suppression of speech, political interference by university administration, classroom and social media surveillance, sexist and homophobic slurs, anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia, threats of violence, including death threats and threats of sexual violence. And it's very important for me to note here that Palestinian academics and students appear to be the most profoundly affected by the chilly climate, along with racialized faculty members and students. And that stands across the board. If you look at cases of harassment, intimidation, et cetera, worldwide in relation to Palestine, you will see that the most frequently targeted are either Palestinian academics and activists or racialized academics and activists. So 20 out of the 40 academics that we interviewed revealed that on and off-campus pro-Israel Jewish organizations had initiated campaigns of harassment and intimidation against them. The organizations they named included Hillel, Hasbara Fellowships, Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CIJA, Honest Reporting Canada, Canary Mission, which is an international organization that doxes Palestine solidarity activists with an emphasis on young, usually Arab, Muslim, or Palestinian activists, the Jewish Defense League, which no longer exists, but does exist, and B'nai B'rith Canada, which has been particularly litigious and aggressive in its pursuit of Palestine solidarity activists. So it is absolutely intolerable, it seems, that pro-Israel organizations within the Jewish community seek to silence criticism of Israel utilizing tactics that range from surveillance of professors to outright threats of violence. We saw this weekend that on social media that Eve Engler, the journalist Eve Engler, who frequently writes critically about Israel, was physically attacked when he stood up to speak out at a conference that was a pro-Zionist conference. And I think that we certainly have recorded other incidents of of violence, and I don't understand why this is. It's a reflection of what's happening in society in general, but it's outrageous to me that this is where things have gotten to. So these are acts of desperation. I have no other way of characterizing them. In face of the worldwide disapproval of Israel's policies of violent assault on Palestinian life writ large. And just to conclude here, I have to say that Jews of conscience must speak out loudly and confidently is the key word here, against this, and refuse to be misrepresented or intimidated by the morally compromised voices that claim to speak for us. And I'll stop there and hand it over back to Jillian.
Thank you so much, Sheryl. You always give us so much to think about and do so elegantly. So thank you. So I'm going to introduce Rabbi David Mivasair. David Mivasair is a rabbi who served 3 synagogues in Pennsylvania and Vancouver, and continues to serve as a rabbi of the synagogue in Thunder Bay, Ontario. He lived in Israel for 4 different years, going back over 50 years to 1971, when he was a student at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and has been deeply involved with Israel and Palestine since that time. Throughout his life, David has been guided by the religious mandates to speak peace and pursue it. Seek peace and pursue it, and speak peace and justice. I'm going to start again. Throughout his life, David has been guided by the religious mandates to seek peace and pursue it, and justice you shall pursue. Rabbi Mivasair is an active member of Independent Jewish Voices and moved to Hamilton just over 4 years ago. So welcome, David, and have about 10 minutes, give or take.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone being here to learn and to share these ideas. And I'm actually going to pick up right where Jill left off. So I'm going to talk about Hamilton. This conference that's prompting us to do this webinar, for some reason, is being put on in Hamilton. And I moved to Hamilton in 2018, and I was very curious about Hamilton. I'd lived in Vancouver, which everybody knows is the most beautiful city in the world to live in. And before I moved to Hamilton, I heard a lot of great things about Hamilton, but I also heard that Hamilton was a place with a lot of anti-Semitism. In fact, the very organizations that Sheryl was just talking about, and I'll name them, CJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, which came out of the actual destruction of the Canadian Jewish Congress, B'nai B'rith Canada, and the Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, all reported that there was a surge of anti-Semitism in Hamilton, and the number of reported incidents of anti-Jewish hatred between 2016 and 2018, when I moved here, increased by 50%. That sounds so horrible. So moving to Hamilton, I wanted to learn more about that. I'd lived here for almost a year. I didn't really experience anti-Semitism, but actually I really haven't experienced much of that anywhere that I've ever lived. I'm 70 years old now. So I decided to get in touch with the Hamilton Police Service and asked the head of the Hate Crimes and Extremism Unit if I could talk with him and I could find out what are the numbers when we are told that between 2016 and 2018, the number of reported anti-Jewish hate crimes increased by 50%. Well, what is that number? And what are these reported anti-Jewish hate crimes? So very kindly, Detective Paul Corrigan met with me in July 2019, and he told me in 2016, there were 20 incidents reported. In 2018, there were 30 incidents. Do the math. That is an increase in 50%. So the math is accurate. But what are these incidents? What is reported? Oh, I just remembered. I have some visuals to share. So Detective Corrigan gave me this report, and he told me about some of the incidents. So one of the incidents that is in the statistics, that's a reported anti-Jewish hate crime, was a van driving through the streets of Hamilton with a swastika on the side. That was reported as an anti-Jewish hate crime. Thankfully, the police investigated it and found that the van belonged to the priest of a local Hindu temple. And people might know that a swastika is a sacred symbol in Judaism. Excuse me, in Hinduism. In Hinduism, a van belonging to a Hindu temple with a swastika on the side is about as anti-Semitic, I'll say, as a church bus with a cross on it, or a van from a synagogue with a Mogen David on it. That's all it is. It's a symbol of their religion. So that was one, and it still is one of the reported anti-Jewish hate crimes. That's the key word. It was reported. So it remains reported. Another one of them, someone went to a synagogue in the morning for the morning prayers, and they saw a flower was taken from the landscape in front of the synagogue. And they called the police and they reported it as an anti-Jewish hate crime. And that today is still on the books as an anti-Jewish hate crime in Hamilton. Another one that Detective Corrigan told me about, there's a very well-known home for elderly people owned and run by the Jewish community here called Shalom Village. Someone was walking down the street in front of Shalom Village, and someone else was going the other direction on the sidewalk. And as they passed each other, the other person said something negative about Jews. So that first person who heard that negative comment called the police and reported an anti-Jewish hate crime. So right there, I've just told you 3 out of the 30. And in fact, there were no acts of violence. No property was destroyed. We haven't heard about anyone losing their job because they're Jewish. We haven't heard about security guards and stores following people around because they're Jewish. We haven't heard about teachers mistreating students because they're Jewish. But these are anti-Jewish hate crimes that are reported in Hamilton. As I lived here longer, I thought, you know, I should look a little more deeply and get a bigger picture. So I filed a Freedom of Information request this past summer with the Hamilton Police Service, so I could understand really what is going on in our community. And I asked them, would they please tell me all the occurrences that led to reported anti-Jewish hate crimes and hate incidents from January 1st, 2016, up until August 1st, 2022. That's almost 7 years. And they took a little while, but they did it. They sent me a list of 176 reported anti-Jewish hate crimes. This is just a sample. You can see it right here. If you look on the wide column on the left-hand side, you can see the nature of these reported events. I'll just read it for anyone that doesn't see it. Mischief, graffiti, mischief, graffiti, mischief, graffiti, mischief, graffiti, mischief, graffiti. Each one is said hate, bias, mischief, graffiti. One of them there is considered suspicious circumstances. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll see almost all of them are classified by the police who investigated them as suspected. You'll see that one there is labeled yes. So out of 176 reported incidents over a period of 7 years, there were 7 yeses. In other words, the police investigated as they should. And in 7 out of 176 cases, they determined that in fact, it actually was an anti-Jewish hate crime or hate incident. 7 out of 176 is about 4%. And in a period of 7 years, it's about 1 incident per year. So I'm just reflecting back a bit to, I think, what Sheryl said about the use and misuse of statistics that we hear from sources like CIJA and B'nai B'rith. And in our specific city, where I've actually looked at the details, there's been about one incident per year over the last 7 years that the police determined actually was motivated by anti-Jewish animus or bias. So I want to share a little bit more about Hamilton. What do we know right here? So in Hamilton, we have very active anti-hate, anti-racism organizations. There's the Hamilton Anti-Racism Resource Center. There's the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion. There's active staff members of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network who present in our schools and present to other organizations here. They have not been contacted about this conference. One person from the Anti-Racism Resource Center was invited to present to, I think, kind of bring his prestige and the kind of apparent support of that organization to this conference. But has there been any meaningful, thoughtful consideration of the Jewish institutional organizations actually engaging with the wider local community here and mutually supporting each other about shared concerns? I haven't heard about that. I want to present a little bit more of what I have learned here since I moved here. So last year, our mayor issued a statement about Yom HaShoah, a day that's widely commemorated as a day for remembering the Holocaust. And he was asked to do this by CIJA and the local affiliate of CIJA, which is the Hamilton Jewish Federation. And he was also asked to endorse or adopt the IHRA that Sheryl talked about earlier. And this is what he said. This is what you see on the screen right here is an exact quote from his statement. Anti-Semitism continues to be a significant issue in Hamilton. Today, I am adopting a working definition of anti-Semitism to guide my office. City council didn't do this. The mayor did it in a comment that he made. So here's what we got from that. CIJA put out a national press release. Jewish community, speaking for all of us, applauds Hamilton's adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So, bit of a stretch, I would say. Gustavo Rimberg, who's the CEO of the Hamilton Jewish Federation, which is ostensibly putting on this conference, said, today, Mayor Eisenberger sent a clear message to hate mongers in our city. There's no room for anti-Semitism in Hamilton. We are pleased to see Hamilton join a growing list of municipalities across the country and around the world in adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And one more quote in this press release by the CIJA Vice President for Local Partner Services, adopting the IHRA definition, the city of Hamilton has demonstrated. So my point here, the city of Hamilton didn't adopt it. The mayor made a comment saying that he would ask his office to take it into consideration. And this is an example of the kind of exaggerated presentation that these mainstream Jewish organizations make. They're using the IHRA as a way to score points and certainly to suppress very honest and necessary public discourse about Israel and Palestine. I directly approached the mayor's office. The mayor's advisor for community relations, who sadly has since passed away, I want to say the late Chris Cutler, directly approached CIJA and asked them to retract or change the statement that was on their website about Hamilton adopting the IHRA. He directly asked them. They didn't do it. It's still there. So they're not even honest after they've been asked. Just want to say another thing or two about Hamilton. Here's the same Gustavo Rimberg, the CEO of the Hamilton Federation, with an op-ed that was published in our paper not long ago, pushing back hard against hatred. Who wouldn't want to push back hard against hatred? We all want to push back hard against hatred. So his claim is, just 2 months before Hamilton's first international conference on anti-Semitism. Of course, there are going to be more of these international conferences. This is the first. 2 hate crimes targeting the Jewish community took place over the course of a few days. So what were these hate crimes? The first occurred when anti-Semitic messages were found scrawled in the downtown core. Well, in fact, what happened is a really, I'll say, mentally unstable person experiencing a mental health crisis took a marker, wrote a swastika, said some bad things about Jews on a couple places like bus stops. One person did that on one day and was immediately caught. The second, more disturbing, involved a break-in at the home of a Jewish community member, which police are investigating as hate motivated. Nothing more. The incidents came just weeks following reports by B'nai B'rith Canada, CIJA, that show Jewish Canadians, representing barely 1% of the population, remain the most targeted religious minority for hate crime. So I will just, I think, close my comments by saying when we look more closely at actually what is going on, it raises very big questions about the accuracy and the reality of what we're being told, certainly about anti-Jewish hate crimes, anti-Semitism. Here in Hamilton, I imagine something similar would be reflected if we look closely at other cities around Canada. And then we have to go back to the question of why is this being presented so prominently? Why is this something that these major Jewish organizations need to invest so much time and energy in? They took out a full-page ad on the back page of the front section of the main newspaper in Hamilton that cost close to $4,000 just to promote this conference. It's an international conference with people from around the world speaking in it. Why is this getting so much attention when in fact the actual occurrences that actually impact people are nothing like what other communities are experiencing, and separating us out from the overall struggle against hate and discrimination in Canada? It just has to raise questions. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, David. Okay, if you want to stop sharing your screen, that would be great. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to leave us with some comments as well. So as I said earlier, I'm Jillian Rogin. I'm a criminal defense lawyer and an assistant professor at the University of Windsor in the Faculty of Law. And I've been involved with the Palestine Solidarity Movement for over 20 years now. I'm a former member of the Jewish Women's Committee to End the Occupation, and I'm currently a member of IJV as well as the Jewish Faculty Network. This past September, I actually started my PhD at Osgoode Hall Law School, and my research focuses on the newly enacted Holocaust denial provision of the Criminal Code and how this provision might undermine anti-racism goals, including solidarity with other groups experiencing racism. I also believe that it's another manifestation of the IHRA finding its way into the Canadian legal landscape. So my comments are based on the very early stages of my research at this point. So in 2022, Parliament enacted Section 319 2.1 of the Criminal Code, and that section criminalizes the willful promotion of anti-Semitism by condoning, denying, or downplaying the Holocaust. Section 319 2.1 only relates to Jewish people, as the heading willful promotion of anti-Semitism implies that it's only the promotion of anti-Semitism that will attract culpability. There was no debate about the new Holocaust denial provision, and it's not clear what types of behavior or speech would not be captured by the already existing hate crime provisions which exist in the criminal code, such that a new enactment would be necessary. And Sheryl talked about that once upon a time. Once upon a time, when the existing hate crime provisions were enacted, the Jewish community, it was the most rigorously debated piece of legislation, some say like in history of Canada ever, because people in the Jewish community were very concerned about criminalization, about freedom of speech, about Holocaust denial, but also wondering whether it was the best way to fight anti-Semitism. Through the debates were really rich, and I'm doing a lot of research about those debates, which are fascinating compared to today, where there is no debate, there's no conversation. So of course, when this provision was adopted into the criminal code, B'nai B'rith supported it, and they supported it because of the purported rise in anti-Semitic incidents of hate in Canada. But of course, as we've heard today, and I hope we're coming to understand, I think the data and methodology often relied on in reports on anti-Semitism in Canada are flawed, because they often include otherwise legitimate criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. In response to what David is talking about, I mean, there are whole bodies of scholarship about police data itself and the flaws and problems with it. And I could get into that maybe in the question and answer period of what David has said, the reasons why it's also flawed. I'm worried that Section 319 2.1 hierarchizes the Jewish experience of genocide. There is no other genocide denial that is criminalized in the criminal code. Additionally, the provision relates, as I said, only and solely to anti-Semitism, excluding other victims of Nazi fascism, including queer people, disabled people, Black people, Roma people, from the gambit of the offense. Referring to the 2021 B'nai B'rith audit, Michael Mostyn, the audit that reports anti-Semitic incidents in Canada by B'nai B'rith, Michael Mostyn, who's the CEO of B'nai B'rith, noted that combating anti-Semitism might entail better reporting of hate crimes and more training and resources for police departments. And in my view, calling for more training and resources to be poured into policing to combat anti-Semitism really stands in stark contradistinction to what many Black and Indigenous people have been calling for in resurgent abolitionist and defunding of the police movements. Further, how are we calling on the Canadian police forces to combat anti-Semitism and any form of racism? It seems futile at best, but maybe more insidious at worst. We have to consider the racist origins of policing in Canada. They were created as part of the project of settler colonization to contain Indigenous people onto reserves and other settler colonial policies, and they were also born out of slave patrols in Canada. Even if there is a rise in anti-Semitism that might justify specific attention to Holocaust denial, the notion that criminalization can bring safety and foster anti-racism ideals, to me, is completely misguided. It undermines solidarity between Jewish and other groups experiencing racism and raises a whole host of questions. Who is likely to be prosecuted under this section? Who will be most harmed by the pouring of resources into policing, and what will prosecution achieve? I'm also worried, of course, that the IRA definition of anti-Semitism will be used to interpret Section 319 2.1, both by the courts and by the police. In 2020, CJA released a policy brief about the IHRA and defining anti-Semitism, and they noted that the RCMP, provincial and local police agencies would benefit from the IHRA definition when investigating hate crimes targeting the Jewish community. Both CJA and B'nai B'rith have been very vocal about their goals of ensuring that the IRA definition is promulgated, and I believe this new Holocaust denial provision is another example of that promulgation. The enactment seems to have as its goal to discipline people into accepting Jewish exceptionalism and hierarchizing the Jewish experiences of hatred. And this goal, I think, serves particular political purposes vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine. It's offensive to use this in this way. So last year I attended a webinar where Erwin Kotler spoke. He began his remarks by saying this, and I'm quoting, "Anti-Semitism is the oldest, most enduring, most virulent, and most sophisticated and lethal of hatreds." Kotler, of course, is Canada's new permanent special envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. The statement that he made, that I heard him make, and he also makes it frequently, engages in a really blatant form of oppression Olympics and places Jewish people at the top of that hierarchy. And this kind of exceptionalism, I think, is extremely dangerous and extraordinarily divisive. I don't think it does anything to combat anti-Semitism. I think it does the opposite. It actually precludes working in solidarity with people who are experiencing oppression, which is absolutely crucial if we want to address anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hatred, which I think we all should be invested in. And I am concerned about the rise of white nationalism. I take it quite seriously. I'm someone who grew up with a lot of anti-Semitism in my life, and I am worried about anti-Semitism. I do want to address it, but the problem is that the conflation of the definition, it precludes us from doing so, which is dangerous to me as a Jewish person. Safety, I think, comes from working in solidarity with all who experience all forms of oppression. It also entails understanding what privileges we bring to that conversation. It entails working to end all forms of racism and other harms, including anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, queer and transphobia, xenophobia, classism, ableism, and misogyny. It entails undoing structures such as white nationalism and all forms of ethno-nationalism, racial capitalism, apartheid, settler colonization, and working to prevent and address all genocides. Never again for anyone. Sadly, all of us here today are very doubtful that any of this will be discussed at the No More Anti-Semitism conference in Hamilton. Former leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, a man named Marek Edelman, once said that to be Jewish is always to be on the side of the oppressed and never on the side of the oppressor. Throughout the history of Jewish people in Canada, many Jewish groups have taken up this banner. We need to foster it, and I'm actually really proud to be part of a movement that already does. So I'm going to ask the panelists, David and Sheryl, to turn their videos on, and maybe we can start to address some of the questions that have been asked. And I encourage all of the attendees to put your questions in the Q&A box. So one question, I think, I'm prepared to answer it, but I think Sheryl and David might have some comments as well. There's a question, please talk about the anti-Semitism that is the most dangerous form, the claim that Jews who stand up for Palestinian rights or criticize Israel are disloyal or self-hating Jews or capos, which I've been called all of those things. We all have, I think. And I wonder, I'm happy to answer it, but I'm also, really, Sheryl, David, if you have comments as well.
Why don't you go ahead, Jill? You obviously, you've thought a lot about it, so you have something.
I have. It used to really bother me. It really did. When I first became active in the Palestine solidarity movement, it was very common to be called all of these things. I guess it is common now for me too, and I just ignore it and move on because, I think Sheryl said it best when you said we have to confidently say and proclaim, free Palestine and our politics, and that anti-Zionism is not anti-racism. I think I just became more comfortable. But I would say that, as part of the Jewish Women's Committee to End the Occupation, we used to put on weekly vigils outside of the Israeli consulate in Toronto, and that's, as an adult, that's where I experienced the most virulent forms of anti-Semitism. Actually, it was coming from ardent Zionist passersby, and I found it painful. It was hard. It was violent. It was, and at protests too. It was very violent, and it makes one wonder if the goal of Zionism is actually to combat anti-Semitism. It didn't feel like it, that's for sure. But I have to say that now, later in the stage in my life, I am much more comfortable proclaiming confidently because I know what I believe and I know who I am, and I just ignore those comments and move on. But I think it is dangerous because, the idea that we're all anti-Semites here is dangerous. It means we can't talk actually about anti-Semitism. I wonder if Sheryl or David have any other comments, or if you want to move on to another question.
I want to comment on the wording that this question includes as it was written. And the person who asked the question said the anti-Semitism that is the most dangerous form. And I would take issue with that. It is not the most dangerous form. There is very dangerous anti-Semitism out there in the world that results still today in Jews being killed simply because they're Jews. We know that, right? There have been mass shootings in synagogues recently, right? So I want to reject the wording of this question. I don't know what that means actually, to even say that that's the most dangerous form of anti-Semitism, because it's not. So I think we have to be very clear. That is not the most dangerous form of anti-Semitism. It's a misuse, an intentional, kind of programmatic misuse of the language and accusations of anti-Semitism to deflect and shut down realistic, honest talk about what Israel does to Palestinians and has been doing for nearly 100 years. Israel hasn't been around 100 years. Nobody say that I think Israel's been around 100 years, but violent anti-Palestinian terrorism has been going on for over 100 years. And if anyone questions that, I urge you to read a book that I just read that changed my understanding of this, called State of Terror by Thomas Suarez. And I mentioned earlier, I'm 70 years old. I've been directly involved with Israel for well over 50 years. I'm still learning, actually, that things are worse than I've ever known. I used to be one of those people who would make the argument, for example, that the Jews in that land were peaceful and legal and never did anything to take Arabs' land until they were attacked, on the night of May 14th, 1948. But as I read more, the book I just mentioned, one other book I just also encourage anyone to read if you have any questions about this, is The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Alain Papé. You'll learn. But anyway, just to get back to this, it's a subterfuge, it's a dodge, it's a way to deflect and change the conversation from talking about seriously the crimes committed in the name of Zionism to talking about, am I a valid Jew or not? Or am I really a rabbi? Sheryl, who lived there for 15 years, I'm sure gets the same kind of attempts to try to shut her down or discredit her, because she's saying things they don't want said.
Thank you. I see there's a couple of questions that are worded in different ways, but they get to the question of concrete steps to take and what do we do about, there's one about what concrete steps we can take to address all of these issues. And then there's one more specifically about the rise of actual anti-Semitism. I think that's partly been addressed in some ways, but I wonder, Sheryl, if, in terms of concrete steps, if you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. I think we're already taking them. I think events like this constitute concrete steps. I think that unfortunately we are at a disadvantage. We are at a disadvantage. People with our views are at a disadvantage in terms of our ability to get our message out. I mean, thank goodness for social media, because if we were still printing out leaflets on the Gestetner machine, like I did 50 years ago, and standing on the corners, we would have a much, we would much less of an influence. I think that people have to raise their voices. I think it's well past time for people to be, I understand, I think one of the dynamics that is not necessarily well understood is that for Jews to speak out, dissident Jews to speak out, can be a very painful and alienating experience. People describe their families being torn apart by this, where you're not you know, their workplaces, their families. I remember seeing someone come to a demonstration a few years ago wearing a wig because she didn't want to be identified by her coworkers. So people, there's a price to be paid if you're a dissenting Jew. I think that one of the things that I think a lot of us would like to see is trying to make dissent a less dangerous activity, more acceptable, more. You think that this would be happening, and I think we see a number of really good signs. Some people who have really, as David, you know, talked about himself, have really, people who, like Tony Lerman, who wrote the book I mentioned earlier, used to be a big shot in the British Jewish community. He ran one of the major research institutes, and he defected in essence and became an anti-Zionist. And as did Peter Beinart. I'm not sure he would identify himself exactly that way. Avram Berg, who used to be head of the Jewish Agency and a member of Knesset. I think the more people are vocal about their views, the safer it becomes. But I think it's still, because we know, and if you read the report, the Chilling Effect report, and you see the vast amount of suppression that's going on, and you understand that if you speak out, and particularly if Jews also in our report come out as having suffered from the repression, et cetera. And, you know, Jillian, you said that you've experienced it. I definitely have. I just won a case against a lawyer in British Columbia who sent me a harassing, homophobic, sexist email and had the bad luck of leaving his prints on it so I could figure out who he was and where he was from. And I filed a complaint against him with the BC Law Society. And he now has been censured and had to pay a $6,000 fine. So we cannot let these things go by. Also, I think if you're in institutions where speech around Palestine, Jewish institutions in particular, has been suppressed, you have to push back for voices to be heard. A couple of months ago, I was on a webinar on anti-Semitism at my synagogue, Darchei Noam, which for years has not allowed a single pro-Palestine voice to be heard. And you know, I mean, I had I had people pulling strings behind the you know, behind the curtain to get me on this, but there was a huge outcry about my being on this webinar, even though I am a member of the synagogue and have been for 30 years. So I think all of us need to summon more courage in how we speak out. And you know, there are those of us there who are there to support you if you do so. Reach out to us. We've been there. We know what it's like, but I understand the cost that might be paid for doing that. And it's the fact that we are required to pay that price is unconscionable. And the fact that you cannot have a discussion internally in the Jewish community about these issues is, I think it bodes ill for the health of the Jewish community. It is really, I mean, we think about Jewish life, and you can't really compare it, but pre-Holocaust Jewish life in Eastern Europe, I mean, there were a million parties and a million organizations, and the debate flowed, and nobody called anybody a capo because they, you know, they were a Bundist or a socialist or whatever. There's just no room for that debate to happen now, and that bodes ill for the health of the Jewish community. And people just disconnect because it's not worth it. Anyway, I'm going on and on, but I think there are many things you can do. Speaking out is one of them. Supporting IJV is another one. We're in the middle of a fundraising drive, and please, everybody, give money. You know, and just and entering into these discussions is really important. Not easy, but important.
Thank you so much. And we have a tech person helping us, and if he's able to put the link to the fundraising campaign in the chat, that would be great. It's IJV fundraising. If you just Google that, Andrew, that would be great to give to the participants. And just, sorry, one question, 1 minute, David, we have to wrap up, but I just want to say also people have put in the question and answer that of course the vigils in Toronto, I think I spoke in the past tense because my participation was in the past tense, but they of course are still continuing and or have begun again, and they are happening every Friday from 5 to 6 p.m. At 2 Bloor Street East. So if you want to go and support those vigils, and they stand outside of the Israeli consulate and have signs like anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism and end Israeli apartheid, please do that. David, did you have it's 3:02, so I'm thinking we should wrap up. Did you have one very last quick comment?
Very short. For anyone who wants to feel more supported in speaking out and taking a position, or even supporting others who are doing that, join IJV. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, and the fundraising is for IJV. There's a question in the about what the fundraising is for, and it is to support the organization of independent Jewish voices. I think there are only 3 paid positions. I think 2 of those are part-time. So it's just 4 of those are, okay, 4 positions. Yeah, 4 positions.
4 full-time positions.
4 full-time positions. Sorry, I misspoke. And so it's to keep that work going. We represent a lot, about 1,000 Jewish people across Canada, and we're doing the work of both solidarity work with Palestinian people and anti-racism in general, including Indigenous solidarity and other forms of solidarity. But we are doing the work, and I encourage everybody to donate. And it's not tax exempt. We are not a charitable organization.
Yeah, there's a very interesting question that I think, if you don't mind me jumping in, and that was, the question referred to the outcome of these recent Israeli elections and whether that is going to turn the Jewish community around. It might if we let it. If I see one more post from a Jewish organization saying, isn't it wonderful that Israel had democratic elections where 71% of the population voted? As opposed to, isn't it horrible that Israel just elected, fascists and kahanists and homophobes to, important positions? I think that we need to call on number one, our government to say something, which they're saying the same nonsense. But the Jewish community, organizations in the Jewish community need to be honest about their rejection of that kind of politics. We're seeing in the States, there have been actually some organizations like the National Council of Jewish Women, we used to work for 1 million years ago, coming out and saying, we don't think this is a good thing. We think this is unhealthy. But, we're not seeing that in Canada. And we do, and I made this point many times, we do live in a more conservative Jewish environment. For a whole bunch of reasons. And David and I are American expats, and I think we have a really good sense of how much harder it is to do this work here than it is in the States. And I'm not going to get into why, but it's we need to compel our organizations to speak out. There is a chokehold on our organization, on the institutional Jewish community here that is applied by the Israelis about what can and cannot be said. And again, these are complicated questions. We could talk for hours about them, but I think that's another thing that needs to happen, and that we can try and help make happen.
Thank you. Well, there are more questions in the question box. There's comments, there's questions. I do think that maybe we can continue this debate in many other forums and have ongoing much needed conversations. But I think we need to wrap up. It's 5 minutes after 3, and so I just want to thank Rabbi David Mivasair and Sheryl Nestel for your wisdom, your words, and your commitment to this cause. And I want to thank all of the attendees for coming. I encourage everybody to speak loudly and proudly Free Palestine and never again for anyone. And not in our name. So thank you, everybody, for coming today.